So welcome everyone to our keynote talk of this evening, of the first day of EPOP 2021. On behalf of the organizing team, which you have seen behind the screen, helping with microphones in the green room, I just want to say thank you for your patience, for getting involved, for coming, for participating of the conference. We've really enjoyed it. We've had really nice panels today, and we have an exciting program for tomorrow. But before that, and as a nice closure to first day, we are having today a keynote talk by Professor Cristóbal Rovira Calvácer. Cristóbal, apart from being a very good friend, he explicitly asked me to mention that he is a full professor at Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, and is also a associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies, COES. His work has been on issues around populism, or at least is most well known about it. He wrote with Cas Mude the Populism, a very short introduction, which is probably one of the most widely used books at the moment in the topic, but also he has edited several volumes on issues about the Latin American right and populism somewhere else, apart from publishing in different areas. This book in particular, and he's going to talk to us, this talk will go in hopefully around the latest book he's edited with Tim Bale from Queen Mary on Riding the Populist Wave. So there's nothing else for me to say, just to explain a bit of the format. What we're going to do, as we have done most of the day, we're going to give our speaker time to talk, to present. I'm going to leave the screen so he has the entire attention. And then we give him some time. After the time, we're going to take some questions. Now, as we have done so far, just write down your questions on the Q&A as soon as they appear. I'll be checking them, and we also have people from the team working with us. So just go on the questions. So if you have a question and you don't want to wait until the end, just write it down in the Q&A. We'll take it. You can vote on it, and everything will go fine. But yeah, that's all from me. So leave you with Cristóbal. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for taking the time. I know it's 5 hours in Chile at the moment, so thank you very much for spending some time with us. The floor is yours.
Okay, many thanks, Javier, for the invitation. Many thanks also for the organizers. They have been quite helpful in explaining how does the software works. And well, one of the positive sides of the pandemic is that we are able to do this sort of event, although I am at the moment in the winter in Santiago de Chile. Here is a bit more than 12 o'clock. And you know that most of you are in London, where it's 5 p.m. And I'm very happy about doing this presentation today. As Javier already mentioned very briefly, I have been working on the topic of populism in the last few years. And recently, I started to get very interested on the interaction between mainstream parties and populist parties, or put in another way, the impact that populist forces have on mainstream parties. And because of that, I started a project with my friend and colleague Tim Bale, and we edited this volume. You can see here the picture of the volume. This is forthcoming now with Cambridge University Press. I think it should be already available if you are in the UK at the moment. And this book is called Riding the Populist Wave, Europe Mainstream Right in Crisis. So, and I will try to do today, it's to present the main ideas of this book. And also at the end, I hope that we have enough time for Q&A. So if you have any questions about either the framework of the project, the empirics about the project, or much more about the overall question about to what extent mainstream right parties in Western Europe are then going a crisis or not, we are very happy. I'm very happy about discuss about these things in the Q&A, of course. So without further ado, then, let me present the overall idea of the presentation, which will be divided in 4 topics. First of all, I will stop in a very simple question. And this is a question about why we need, in my personal opinion, why we need more research and better research about the mainstream right in Western Europe. And I think this is a relevant question. And I hope that we'll be able to convince you that this type of research is quite relevant nowadays. Secondly, I will stop on conceptual issues, and I want to present the sort of conceptual framework that we develop for understanding right-wing parties, and in particular the distinction between mainstream right parties on the one hand and far-right parties on the other hand, so that we can better understand why there is a problematic relationship between these two different kinds of right-wing projects. The third part of the presentation will focus on the theoretical framework. This is the overall idea that mainstream right parties in Western Europe are undergoing a very severe crisis, and this is because of the difficult appearance of the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution at the same time, and I will explain these concepts in a minute. And finally, I should have a bit of spare time to talk about the main findings of the book. So let me go then to the first part of the presentation, and this is about the simple question. Why should we care about the mainstream right in Western Europe? So most of you are familiar with Western European politics, and you probably know that there are two topics that generate a lot of debate and attraction. And this is, on the one hand, the decline of social democracy, and on the other hand, the rise of the populist radical right. Nevertheless, there is much less interest in the current situation of the mainstream right. And I think this is a problem for comparative politics, and particularly if we want to understand the future of liberal democracy in Western Europe, we need to put much more attention on the mainstream right. Before I give a more detailed answer about the relevance of studying the mainstream right, let me present two pieces of evidence that I think are relevant for the sort of debate that I want to develop now. The first piece of evidence is a graph that we generated with Tim at the beginning of our book, in which we present the electoral results in national elections of all right-wing parties in Western Europe. And we do that by presenting the average per decade. You see the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. And we divide for the three most common party families within the right-wing bloc. This is the Conservative Party family, the Liberal Party family, and Christian democracy. And we also add the populist radical right here. So if you look at the first graph here, the first issue that is relevant here is that the populist radical right has been able to establish itself in the continent. And as you can see here, it's slowly going up in the amount of votes that the party family gets. The second fact important in that figure is that you see that both Conservative Party family and Christian Democratic Party family, it's going down. And this is particularly evident for the Christian Democratic Party family. This is the red line in this graph. And finally, if you look, the Liberal Party family has a very stable situation in terms of the amounts of votes that it gets. Just to complement that figure, I will present the mirror one, and this is about left-wing parties in Western Europe. And here again, it's the average that these party families get across Western European party systems for the 80s, 90s, 2000, and 2010s. And you can see here in this figure that the decline of social democracy, it's a very new phenomenon, something that started in the last decade, and that's probably related to the end of the third way politics undertaken by Schroeder in Germany and Tony Blair in the case of the UK. And also you can see in this figure that the Green Party family also has been able to establish itself in the electoral arena, but is much less successful than the populist radical right. So if you compare these two figures. So finally then, if you look at these two figures, I think that what is important here, it becomes very clear that catch-all parties are suffering in the contemporary situation. And this is very clear for the blue line, the Social Democratic Party family, and also if you look at the red line, which is the Christian Democratic Party family. So having presented that first piece of evidence, let me go back now to the main question. Why should we care about the mainstream right in Western Europe? So the first point that I want to develop here is that mainstream right-wing parties are extremely relevant in contemporary Western Europe because they normally form governments, either by putting the prime minister or by collaborating in the process of building a coalition government. Nevertheless, we have very limited comparative research on the evolution of those parties. Don't get me wrong, there is some research about the mainstream right, but most of this research is about case studies. Tim Bale, for example, has done an excellent job on the Conservative Party in the UK. But what is missing, in my opinion, is something that compares different mainstream right parties across Western European countries. So, such as, for example, the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, the Conservative Party in the UK, the Partido Popular in Spain, etc. So how can we explain then the absence of research on the mainstream right in Western Europe? And I think there are two main reasons for that. The first one, it's an ideological bias from us, from scholars. Most of us tend to identify with left-wing political forces or with social democratic parties. And because of that, I think we are obsessed with the questions about the decline of social democratic parties. And we are also obsessed with the populist radical right, because this is normally the party family that we dislike. And because of that, we do a lot of research on the populist radical right, including myself. But the second reason, I think it's also interesting one, and it's not related to something on ideology. It's much more because the decline of electoral support for mainstream right parties has been declining, but it's a gradual phenomenon. Remember the graph that I presented before for Christian Democratic Party family that slowly goes down. And because of that, I think we are less aware of the problem that mainstream right parties are suffering today, which is different from social democracy, because remember the figure, it's quite abrupt, the tendency of going down in the amount of votes as social democratic parties gets. So to finish then this first part of my presentation, so why is it then we need more research on the mainstream right? And I think that because if we are able to provide more evidence, comparative evidence about the evolution of mainstream right parties in Western Europe, we are going to have very important knowledge about the current and future state of liberal democracy across the region. And this is related to the next point that I want to develop. And this is because mainstream right parties are competing with populist radical right parties or different types of far-right parties. And the interaction between these two party families, it's very problematic for the liberal democratic system. So let me then move to the second part of the presentation, and this is about the concepts that we develop in this book that I have written with my friend and colleague Tim Bale. Let's start with a very basic fact, and this is about how we understand right-wing politics, and this is for most of you something very normal, so to say, not very new. We follow here the approach of Norberto Bobbio, according to whom the right should be thought as a political ideology that is characterized by the belief that the main inequalities within society are natural and largely outside of the purview of the state. What is interesting is that if you go to the small book of Bobbio, which was published at the beginning of the 1990s, he emphasizes that the right-wing ideology can be seen in two different dimensions, in the socio-economic dimension or in the socio-cultural dimension. This means that a right-winger, someone who believes that there are natural equalities, might think that these natural equalities are related to the socio-economic domain, for example, issues related to welfare or to salaries, but they might be related also to socio-cultural dimension, such as, for example, gay rights or gender issues. So, and I think this is something important to have in mind, because being a left-winger or a right-winger can be either or in the socio-economic or socio-cultural dimension, or sometimes they can be combined. And this is something that I will go back to the presentation. So based on that understanding, the next point that we do is to make the distinction between two different types of right-wing parties. On the one hand, the mainstream right, and on the other one, the far right. So if you want to understand why these two different types of right-wing parties are different, we say that this is mainly because of two dimensions or two factors. The first one is that mainstream right parties normally adopt moderate programmatic positions. This means these are parties that defend a right-wing ideology, but they translate that into policy positions that normally tend to be relatively moderate. But there is a second factor that, in my opinion, is even more relevant than the previous one. And this is that mainstream right parties are loyal to the political system. This means they're in favor of liberal democracy. Put in other words, when they defend a right-wing ideology, they're going to do it within the institutional setting of liberal democracy, and they're not going to attack the liberal democratic system. When we try to understand the far right, the situation is here different, because these are parties that adopt radical programmatic positions. But again, the second aspect, it's even more relevant. These are parties that, I'm using here the concept of Juan Lins. These are parties that are either semi-loyal or are disloyal to the political system, which means these are parties that are against liberal democracy in some cases, or are parties that directly against democracy per se. So we know that this is still something a bit broad, and because of that, we go even one level lower in the ladder of abstraction, so to say, and then we try to distinguish different party families within the mainstream right and within the far right. So if we go to the mainstream right, what we say is that you can normally identify three different party families: Christian Democratic Party family. The obvious example would be in Germany, the CDU. You can think also about the Liberal Party family. A classic example would be the Project En Marche of Emmanuel Macron in France. And you can also identify the Conservative Party family, which the classic example would be in the UK with the Conservative Party. I don't have time now in this presentation, but if you want, we can talk in the Q&A, because we develop here some ideas about why these different party families belong to the mainstream right, but also what makes these party families peculiar, so to say, or different from each other. Last point about that, the Liberal Party family is the most tricky one, because remember that being a right-winger or a left-winger is both on the socio-economic or in the socio-cultural dimension, and liberal parties can adopt different positions on that. You might have liberal parties, as in the case of En Marche in France, that it's right-wing, we can say, on the economic dimension, it's liberal on that dimension, but it's sort of left-winger on the cultural dimension. And this is why the Liberal Party family, I still think that can be considered a member of the mainstream right, but it's a bit more problematic, and we need to analyze each case in detail to better emphasize in which dimension can a Liberal Party be a right-wing party or not, so to say. So if we go now to the far right, the other side of the block, so to say, there is here the classic distinction, and I'm following here the work of Casmude, and this is a distinction between the populist radical right on the one hand and on the extreme right on the other hand. The populist radical right, one example here that I'm putting, is the Lega Nord in Italy, but there are several other examples that we can use: AfD in Germany, Sweden Democrats in Sweden, the Austrian Freedom Party, etc. And the populist radical right, we know that it's different from the extreme right, because this party family, at least it's nominally in favor of liberal democracy, whereas the extreme right, it's very clear that it's an authoritarian party family. The example that I'm putting here, it's Golden Zone. So I hope that now we have some clarity about the concepts that we develop in the book, and let me finish that last slide about the concepts that we develop in our book with something that I think it's relevant, and particularly if we are thinking about political parties and if we are thinking about comparative politics. When we are undertaking empirical research, we love to use certain classifications, as the one that I'm putting here, in which we try to identify different political parties and we put them in different boxes. And I think it's important that we do this type of research, but we need to be careful with that type of research, because we normally tend to assume that a party will stay always within one of these boxes. For example, we assume that the Christian Democratic Party family, it's a member of the mainstream right, and it should stay like this for its whole life. But in practice, it can't happen that a Christian Democratic Party in one country, for example, can transform over time and can move from the category of a mainstream right party into a far right party. Or in theory, it could happen also the opposite, that you might have a far right party that evolves over time and transforms into a mainstream right party. And I think this is something that we need to take into consideration. The obvious example here would be the question about how should we classify the Republican Party in the United States during or after Donald Trump. And if you ask me, we can talk also about that in the Q&A if you want, but if you ask me that question, I will tell you the Republican Party in the United States during and after Trump is anything but a mainstream right party. And it's a far right party indeed. But I would also say that probably not long time ago, probably in the 80s and 90s, the Conservative Party in the Republican Party in the US was a mainstream right party, but it transformed into a far right party. And this is the main fear of what might happen in some Western European countries, And this is a question about whether mainstream right parties can end up transforming into something else, moving into the camp of the far right. And if this happens, this might have deep consequences for the liberal democratic regime. And this connects to the third part of my presentation, and this is about the theoretical framework that we develop in our book. So let me go to the theory then that we advance in our book project with Tim. So the theoretical framework that we have developed with Tim, it's based on the argument about the silent revolution versus the silent counter-revolution. I assume that most of you are familiar with this debate, but I will present that very briefly. If you go to the classic work of Ronald Inglehart about the silent revolution, he has been able to demonstrate at a theoretical level, but also an empirical level, that Western European societies have experienced a profound change over time because of a very successful economic modernization process. And one of the consequences of that economic modernization process is a value transformation, the emergence of post-material values, which translates into the formation of a new party family, which is the Green Party family. Of course, in some countries of Western Europe, that party has been more successful than in others. For example, Germany would be one of the paradigmatic examples about that. But if you look about the political debate across Western European societies, even in those countries in which green parties are non-existent, green issues are becoming more salient. And this is again related to the argument about the silent revolution. Nevertheless, we need to be aware of the so-called silent counter-revolution. And as far as I know, the concept has been coined by Piero Ignasi in a classic paper published in 1992 in the European Journal of Political Research, in which he argues that if we want to understand the emergence and consolidation of the populist radical right, we need to understand that there is something such as a silent counter-revolution. And this means that there is a faction of the electorate within Western European societies that is not very happy with this value transformation. And because of this uneasiness with the value transformation of Western European societies, you have a sector of the electorate that is in favor of certain conservative values, nativist values, and these are the ones who are, to a certain extent, the fertile soil for the emergence of populist radical right parties. So if we consider then the interaction between the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution, we know that this has generated a multidimensional political space across Western European societies. And this means that both economic issues and cultural issues are very relevant nowadays. And also, we know that one of the consequences of the emergence of the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution is that the political space is becoming increasingly fragmented, and also there is growing polarization. This sort of transformation of the political space within Western European societies has a deep impact on mainstream right parties, which again is the main focus of our book. And this is because it generates a tension that, in my opinion, it's impossible to solve. If you are a mainstream right party nowadays, you have the tension that on the one hand, you will try to appeal to those voters who are in favor of the liberal and progressive values that are related to the silent revolution. And on the other hand, you also would like to appeal to those voters who sympathize with the authoritarian and nativist ideas that are related to the silent counter-revolution. The problem is that if you're a mainstream right party, you cannot do the two things simultaneously, because you can either please those who are in favor with the silent revolution, or you can please those who are with the silent counter-revolution. But trying to keep these two factions of the electorate together within the same party, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And this is one of the main reasons that mainstream right parties are experiencing a very difficult situation nowadays. Nevertheless, we go one step further in the book, and we develop two additional arguments about the problems that mainstream right parties are undergoing nowadays. The first one is that we argue in our book that because of the emergence of these two revolutions, mainstream right parties are experiencing a very difficult trade-off between these three classic dimensions: the office-civic dimension, policy-seeking dimension, and vote-seeking dimension. To a certain extent, this has been always a problem for mainstream parties in general, but because of the emergence of these two revolutions, the trade-off between these three different dimensions is becoming much harsher than before. And many of the case studies that we included in our edited volume develop that sort of argument in some detail. And finally, we also say that the emergence of these two revolutions translates into 4 key policy challenges for the mainstream right. Of course, these are not the only policy challenges, but we think that these are the four more problematic, so to say, for the mainstream right in contemporary Western Europe. And these are the issues of European integration, immigration, moral issues, and the welfare state. So I have spoken now for a bit more than 20 minutes, so I think I still have like 10 minutes. And in the next 10 minutes that I have, what I would like to do is to present some of the main findings of our project. So to do that, let me emphasize something. This is a project that I have been developing with my friend and colleague, Tim Bale. Yes, sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Hello, everything okay?
Yes. Yes, I'm here, but I'm hearing Julia on the.
Oh, okay.
That's where I stop. I'm not sure if the other people are also hearing Julia.
No. So go on. Just you can continue.
Yes. I don't know if Julia can stop because she's speaking with someone else, and I'm hearing that the whole time. So.
Okay.
Apologies.
You have technical issues. Right. If you can move on, because we can't hear her. So
Okay. It's a bit weird because I'm hearing her. So if you can tell her that would be great.
It's like TV presenter. You have the director in the ears.
Okay. So apologies. Then I will continue. And as I was mentioning here, this is a collective project.
Sorry, interruption.
And something that I have been developing with Tim Bale. It's forthcoming now with Cambridge University Press. And in the book, what we have done is to include 8 case studies. You can see here the map that I presented. These are the case studies in Sweden, in the UK, in the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Spain. And we also include 2 chapters that are large N case studies. One it's on the demand side, and the other one is in the supply side. I will present very briefly that slide in which you can see the titles of the different chapters that we have in the book, and what is more important, all the colleagues that have collaborated in this edited volume. So again, don't think that I'm someone extremely smart. What I have is very good friends and colleagues who have been willing and had a lot of interest in investing time and energy in writing these different chapters for our edited volume. And again, we have 2 large N case studies. If you look, one on the demand side by Elko Hartfeld, one on the supply side by Tariq Abuchade and Werner Krause. And then we have all these 8 case studies: Austria, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. And of course, at the beginning, we have an introduction written by myself and Tim, and a conclusion that we wrote also together. So in the next minutes that I have, again, what I want to do, it's based on the overall project, these 12 chapters. I want to talk about which are the main findings of our book. So the first question, that it's an important one, is to what extent does the theoretical framework work for all countries? And when I'm talking about the theoretical framework, it's this argument about the tension between the silent and the silent counter-revolution as the main reason of why mainstream right parties are struggling in the contemporary era across of Western European societies. So the question, to answer that question, I would say yes, but. Why yes, but? Because we find that across all the countries, and this is for the case studies, but also for the large N case studies, we realize that all the mainstream right parties are struggling to adapt to this new scenario, but there are important differences related to the time of the consolidation of the populist radical right. And you have countries like Austria and France, in which the populist radical right was able to emerge and consolidate very early on, already in the 1980s. Whereas you have other countries like Germany and Sweden, in which the rise of the populist radical right is a relatively new phenomenon. And because of that, mainstream right parties in Germany and Sweden are struggling recently, so to say, to adapt, whereas in other countries, they have been struggling for a long period of time. And also, we have to say there are two partial exceptions to our theoretical framework, and these two partial exceptions are Italy and Spain. Why partial exceptions? If you want to understand the situation of the political situation of Italy and Spain, I would say that the twin revolutions, the tension between the silent and the silent counter-revolution, are very present in these two countries, and they're relevant for understanding the situation of the mainstream right. Nevertheless, if you want to understand the origins of the problem of the mainstream right in these two countries, there are other explanations that are more relevant than the framework that we have developed. In the case of Italy, as you probably know, in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a collapse of the party system. And because of the collapse of the party system, the Christian Democratic Party almost disappeared from the country. But the disappearance of the Christian Democratic Party, again, was related to the collapse of the party system, mainly because of the Tangentopoli corruption scandal, and not because of the rise of the twin revolution. And in the case of Spain, the PP, the Partido Popular, the mainstream right party, is really struggling nowadays. But the main reason why the party started to struggle is for the combination of three different factors. And this is the rise of the Great Recession, the emergence of different corruption scandals that affected the political class as a whole, but mainly or particularly the Partido Popular, and also because of the Catalan independence movement. So that's about the theory. If we think now about the empiric, so to say, if you remember, I mentioned there are four key policy challenges for the mainstream right. To what extent are these key policy challenges equally daunting across of the different countries that we analyze in our edited volume? And I would say not all of them are as relevant, and some of them are more daunting or problematic than others. If we think about the issue of the European integration, one of the findings of our book is the majority of mainstream right parties across of Western Europe are still in favor of the European Union project. This is particularly the case for the Christian Democratic Party family, but not only for that one. And this means that Brexit, it's probably not something to be seen, to be imitated for other parties across of Western Europe. And in part, this is because the process has been extremely messy, but also because it's not very clear that by exiting the European Union, the tension between the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution is going to disappear from the country. And in fact, the problem is going to be there anyway. And this means that if mainstream right parties push the agenda of going out of the European Union, they will not solve the main issue in a perfect way, so to say. Then the second issue that we mentioned in our theoretical framework was immigration. And this is definitely the most problematic dimension, because we realize, and this is something that it's shown in the individual case studies, but also in the large N case studies, that all mainstream right parties are becoming more restrictive on the issue of immigration. And this is something that, again, there are certain differences across cases, but the overall picture is that they're getting tougher on immigration. It might be that the COVID pandemic changes that a bit because there is less saliency to the issue of immigration. But if we move to a post-COVID-19 world, then my feeling is that immigration is going to get a lot of saliency again. And this is why the issue of immigration will continue to be something very problematic for the mainstream right, in which they need to take a position. If we think about moral issues, then we didn't find a clear trend for all the cases that we included in our analysis, either looking individually or in the large N case studies. And our feeling here is that the politicization of certain moral issues, such as gay rights or abortion, for example, it's much more related to issues that happen at the national level rather than something happens at the supranational level. Think, for example, about David Cameron. There was a moment in which he decided to politicize the issue of gay rights, or the same with Angela Merkel. But the timing of that was different in the UK than it was in the case of Germany. And again, we don't find here a general trend across the different countries and the cases that we include in our book. And finally, if we think about positions on the welfare state, our feeling here is this is probably related to the socioeconomic profiles of those who support the mainstream right. And one of our findings that we advance in our book is that when you have mainstream right parties that have a relatively heterogeneous base of support, which means that they're able to get voters from lower class, middle class, and upper class citizens, so to say, then we can expect that that type of party will be a bit more in favor of defending the welfare state and vice versa. So which means if you have a party, by contrast, a mainstream right party that focuses only on richer people, so to say upper class citizens, then there is a bigger chance that we'll be more against the welfare state and adopt a bit more of a neoliberal position. Last slide about the findings is now thinking about the different party families. So we already presented something about these different issues that we thought that are relevant for the mainstream right. But what about the different mainstream right party families that we identify in our book? The first issue that I want to emphasize again is that all mainstream right parties, it doesn't matter if we are talking about Christian Democrats, conservatives, or liberals, it looks like that all of them are adopting harsher positions on immigration. Nevertheless, and I think this is interesting, this doesn't mean that these parties automatically are taking negative positions on other issues of the silent revolution, such as, for example, gay rights or gender issues. And in fact, it could be the case, and it seems like this, that many of these parties, in fact, are getting more liberal on these other dimensions, but they're getting harsher only on the issue of immigration. So if we go now to each of the different party families, so our feeling is that if we think about the conservative party family, it looks like the authoritarian factions are winning the battle. And this means that conservative parties are slowly moving from the mainstream right towards the far right. I don't think that there are far right parties, but I think this is an open question. And this is why we need more and better research over time to look at the transformation of those parties. The Conservative Party in the UK, it's a role model in this way, but friends and colleagues of mine working in Sweden are telling me also that Moderata, the mainstream right party in Sweden, it's also slowly moving a bit more into that sort of direction. In fact, it looks like Moderata is willing to build a coalition with the Sweden Democrats, and this is related to the transformation within the Conservative Party in the case of Sweden. If we think about the Christian Democratic Party family, it's very clear that they have an electoral decline over time, something that I presented at the beginning of my PowerPoint presentation. But what is also interesting about that party family is that most of those parties are very interested in the office-seeking dimension. And one of the consequences of that is that this has a cost in terms of the policy-seeking dimension and the vote-seeking dimension. And this is something that we can observe in Austria and in Germany, where the Christian Democrats are still able to put the prime minister, but also in the case of the Netherlands, where they don't put the prime minister, but they are willing to enter into government, which means having access to office, but of course blurring their own positions on issues of the policy dimension. And this has long-term consequences for these parties. And finally, when we talk about the Liberal Party family, then we find here a lot of ideological variants. Then you have someone like Mark Rutte in the Netherlands, who is building a sort of an ersatz version of the populist radical right, or you have someone like Macron, who is defending or adopting very liberal positions, both in the economic dimension and in the cultural dimension. So I think that I'm already in my 35 minutes. If Javier allows me, I will just want to present a last slide in which I will try to present which are the future research agenda, in my opinion, about the mainstream right.
Go on.
So
go on. You have
I still have like 2 minutes. That's good. So, and then let me present then the last one, and this is about the future research agenda on the mainstream right. The first question that I think is quite crucial is to what extent the ideas, theories, and concepts that we develop in this book do travel beyond Western Europe. I'm talking today from Chile, from Latin America, And for example, I'm very interested about thinking to what extent that sort of arguments are useful for understanding what is going on in my own country. But I think other scholars are also very interested in these type of questions when you think about Brazil, when you think about countries in Eastern Europe, and also countries in the United States. And I think that it would be quite interesting to see much more research, not only, again, about individual case studies, but comparative case studies, or at least individual case studies that try to use a sort of comparative framework. And I think this is a very interesting research question, in my opinion. The second future research agenda that I think it's relevant is something that I have already mentioned, but I want to emphasize. And this is that we need to be much more careful when using the concept of the mainstream right. And remember that mainstream right parties are mainstream on the one hand because they adopt moderate policy positions, and on the other hand, and this is the second aspect that I think it's even more relevant than the previous one, is because they are loyal to the liberal democratic system. But we need to be careful with that, because if mainstream right parties transform over time and are willing to adopt the agenda of the silent counter-revolution, this means that these parties, I don't know when, but there could be a moment in time in when these parties are not mainstream anymore, as is the case with the Republican Party in the United States. And this is why I think it's important to undertake more studies, again, either in individual case studies or comparing different case studies to analyze this transformation, so to know that we are using the right labels, and the right labels not only to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges, but also because we know that mainstream right parties have a different relationship with the liberal democratic system than populist radical right parties. And finally, the other question that I think it's quite important, and this is something that I have been trying to develop myself, this is about negative partisanship towards the populist radical right, and to what extent negative partisanship towards populist radical right party might be driven or not by the role of the mainstream right. And the argument that I want to develop here, and this is how I want to close, is that if mainstream right parties are willing to adopt the agenda of the populist radical right, and or are willing to build a coalition with the populist radical right, through that way they are going to legitimize the populist radical right, which will mean that negative partisanship towards these parties will decline. And this might have deep consequences for the liberal democratic system in Western Europe in the near future. And I think now I have spoken already for 40 minutes, so I will close with that, and thank you again for your time, and very open to questions and reflections about the presentation.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal, for your time and for your talk. It's very interesting and also very, I would say, topical given what's happening in Europe at the moment. So for those of you, all the 40 of you who are watching this, please use the Q&A option to ask questions. I'm going to be reading them, but just to kind of start a discussion while you think about your amazing questions, I'm gonna probe you on two separate topics. One of them was at the end of your talk when you talk about the avenues of future research, but I'd like to know what you think about it, because the description or the definition of a mainstream party or mainstream right party, you talk about this notion about liberal democracy, but isn't that more like an inductive process in which basically you looked at parties that are on the right and usually are part of governments, because you say that that's the relevance of the whole thing, that these parties are usually in government or relevant for government formation. And then you look at what are the characteristics of these parties vis-a-vis whatever other parties on the right. And therefore, my question would be, wouldn't be more, is what is more relevant? Is it their support to liberal democracy as a foundational value of the parties, or is the topic of being in government in a democratic context, a kind of winning elections, the office-seeking aspect of it? Because in the end, that I think my question is whether we should redraft what mainstream means, whether it's about being in government or whether it's about particular views on democracy. And my second point has to do with something you touch upon when you discuss about immigration and it was about, well, we didn't see much of this, and maybe after the COVID pandemic. But then I had a question on the role of, I want to put it simple, of epistemic crisis that we're talking about. So the notion that experts are not reflective of the popular opinion, or that they're unnecessary. And we've seen a lot of that in populist radical right parties. We've seen that a lot in Trump, in the Republican Party in the US. We saw some of it in Brexit discussions in some of the people. So I wonder if there is something there on, and this is more like on the supply side, and whether you think, and maybe this is kind of just a conjecture, that the pandemic in some ways has changed that trend towards an epistemic crisis, or a lack of trust in experts.
Many thanks. Good questions, reflections. So let me start with the first one. This is about the conceptualization of mainstream right parties, and which are the dimensions at the end of the day that are more important when it comes to identifying those parties. And as you were saying, there are two sort of dimensions that we can use here. One would be support for the liberal democratic system, and the other one would be that these parties are able to access government, so to say. And if you ask me, I would say that from a comparative politics perspective, in the sense that we want to put different parties into different boxes so that we know to which sort of party family they belong, I think that the crucial aspect is support for the liberal democratic system. And this is, again, why these parties are mainstream and they're not radical. And they're mainstream because they're in favor of the liberal democratic system, which means they might want to undertake certain transformation in the terms of a right-wing ideology, but they are keen on doing this transformation within the rules of the game of the liberal democratic system. And that makes the crucial distinction between mainstream right parties and non-mainstream right parties, which are of different kind. As I was talking, you can identify populist radical right parties and extreme right parties. But there is the second dimension that you also mentioned here, and this has to do with the empirical fact, so to say, that mainstream right parties have access to government. And this is the history of many mainstream right parties across of Western Europe. And even if you think about Western European politics nowadays, you have mainstream right parties controlling the executive office. This is the case of Germany with Angela Merkel. This is the case of the UK with Boris Johnson. So, and I think this is exactly why undertaking more research on the mainstream right is so relevant. And this is because these parties are the ones, not the only ones, but are one of the main actors when it comes to building governments. And it's also relevant to analyze to what extent these parties are willing to build a coalition with the populist radical right or not, and which is the impact that that sort of coalition has not only on the democratic system, but also on the mainstream right itself. But it could be the case that precisely because of that collaboration with the populist radical right, mainstream right parties start to develop a sort of different ideological mix by which they don't follow the mainstream right character anymore, which means that they're not keen on accepting the liberal democratic rules of the game. So, and related to your second question, and this is the issue of a sort of epistemic crisis here, I think there is a lot of research showing that contemporary democracies are experiencing different types of challenges, and two challenges that the literature normally identify are, on the one hand, populist politics of different kind, and on the other one, the rise of technocratic politics. And there are some scholars, and this is not my own argument, I'm thinking here about different scholars like Inverness Asiti, for example, or also Chris Bickerton have developed that sort of argument, that populism and technocracy to a certain extent challenge representative politics in similar way from different points of view. But of course, in the case of populism, it's about defending the people against the elite. And in the case of technocracy, it's defending the elite against the people. But both have this monist and moral understanding about how societies work, in the sense that there is an elite and there is some people, so to say. Whereas representative democracy is built on the idea of pluralism, that society is much more complex. It's not only about the elite versus the people, it's about different individuals, different groups, and it's trying to build bridges between these different sort of groups and individuals that exist within a society. So having said that, The issue of an epistemic crisis and to what extent the pandemic is changing that or not, I think that because of the rise of the pandemic, we saw, at least at the beginning, I would say, that many national governments were giving a lot of room of maneuver or leverage to experts. And in fact, politicians started to take decisions based on the guides of the experts, so to say. This is what happened at the beginning of the crisis. But my feeling is as soon as the crisis is going out, and this is the hope of many people, including myself, that because of the vaccination process, everything will slowly start to get more normal, we should see that the power of those technocrats or those experts should diminish. But at the same time, we also see that there are certain factions of the electorate that are very upset about the excessive power that those technocrats might have. And this is in part one of the ways in which populist radical right parties try to mobilize their own bases of support. And I think that sort of battle is going to stay over time in the next few years, although the pandemic might disappear.
Just well, before we continue with the question, do you mind stop sharing your screen so we can all see your face rather than
sure, apologies.
the slides?
Apologies.
Okay, so I have a question here from John Curtis. Why have Christian Democrat parties suffer more than conservative parties, and does the decline of Catholicism not have a role in this story? So I don't know if you want to take it one by one, and then we can continue.
Sure. This is an excellent question, and the obvious answer would be yes. And why I think it's the obvious answer, in part because of the theoretical framework that we develop. Remember that we are saying that Western European societies are experiencing this tension between the silent and the silent counter-revolution. And the silent revolution means that post-material values are getting more relevant. And this means also that people are getting less religious than before. And this is a trend that there are certain differences across societies, but in most Western European societies, we see that the amount of people that identify with a religion is declining, particularly with the Catholic religion. And because of that, we also see that this process of emancipation, so to say, it's driving a new type of electorate that it's much more volatile. These are people that in one election, they might vote for the Green Party. In another election, they might vote for the Liberal Party, or depending on the issue at stake, they might vote for the Christian Democratic Party. And this is completely different from the scenario of Europe in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in which the people were still bounded to certain organizations such as the Catholic Church. And because of that sort of tradition, they were willing to support the Christian Democratic Party family. And I think this is part of the reason of why Christian Democratic parties are struggling. But I think there is another reason, and this is something that I have been talking with Jan Werner Müller from Princeton University, who has been also doing some research on Christian democracy in Western Europe. And he has this idea that I think it's very compelling, that one of the problems of Christian democratic parties, and this is related to the office-seeking dimension, is that they are so obsessed with getting into power that it's getting less and less clear which is the policy dimension that these parties defend. Think about the elections nowadays in Germany. So, and probably if you ask a voter, what is the Christian Democratic Party willing? They will say, well, try to manage the crisis. But beyond that, what is really the ideology of the party there? And this is anything but clear. If you think about the Social Democratic Party or the Green Party, voters probably have an idea about which are the policies that parties are defending. Whereas in the case of Christian democracy, this is getting very blurry. And this is not only, but mainly because of this obsession with the office-seeking dimension. And I think this would be the second explanation of why Christian democratic parties are really suffering in the contemporary situation.
Thanks, Cristobal. So Steve Fisher asks, says that part of the, I lost the question, sorry. Part of the silent revolution was environmentalism as well as cultural liberalism, which you focused on. What role you see environmental issues playing for the future of the mainstream right?
Well, this is, again, an interesting point. And we had, when we organized this book project, we had a conference in London, in fact, in Queen Mary University. These were pre-COVID times, so we were able to fly from different countries, get together, sit down 2 days and discuss about these issues. And one of the debates that we had with the different colleagues who participated here is that if you go back to the original work of Engelhardt, In fact, he was thinking the whole time that the environment is going to be the key driving issue that will polarize the electorate within Western European societies. But the chapters were telling us that although the environment is relevant, immigration is the issue that is getting much, much more problematic for the mainstream right, particularly because of the rise of the populist radical right. And as you remember in these key policy challenges that I mentioned, immigration is the one that is generating this obsession for the mainstream right because they are competing with the populist radical right on the other hand. Nevertheless, it could be the case that that might change in the near future, and this is because of climate change. I think that nowadays it's getting much more evident that the climate change has arrived, that is affecting our daily life, so to say, and this will start affecting, it's already affecting the economic system. And we know also that mainstream right parties do have like very good connections with the business association and with the business community. So just at a theoretical level, there are some reasons why the environment might be something that mainstream right parties need to adapt as well. But this means that they will need to refresh their own ideological portfolio and think which is the type of policy package that they will develop in terms of environmental politics.
Cristobal. I have other questions here. Are the voters driving the silent revolution older generations? And if they are older generations, what role did they play when the mainstream right parties were at their height, kind of the top point?
Yes. Well, the whole argument about the silent revolution, it's an argument about generational change. And in fact, this is what Ron Lingerhard was saying. So to say, you have like economic modernization. Through that economic modernization, people start slowly to change their own values. And this is why he calls the silent revolution. This is a very gradual and subtle phenomena. And of course, you have like in Europe, it's not from one day to another that post-materialism arrived, and it was not from one day from another that the populist radical right arrived. And because of that, it's clear that these older generations were the ones that were more supportive of mainstream right parties. This is particularly evident for Christian democratic parties. This is related to the previous question again about related to religiosity. Those who go to the church are normally older people and not necessarily the new generations. And part of the problem for mainstream right parties is to what extent they are able to attract new voters. And this is a serious problem, I think, particularly for Christian democratic parties, but not only for them. And the whole issue is to what extent mainstream right parties and the different party families we identify have the capacity to adopt a policy platform that can attract these different constituencies. And I think this is one of the main challenges that these parties are experiencing. And some of them have been more successful than others. Think, for example, about Emmanuel Macron with his liberal project. And he's able to attract, to a certain extent, the more well-off people and to a certain extent, a bit of the younger generations. But we are also seeing a transformation of the populist radical right that has been able slowly, there is variance across countries, but in countries, it has been able also to attract a bit more of youngsters. And this generates, again, more tension between these two different party families that are competing within the right-wing bloc.
I have to jump into this last point because how much of that is also a gender question? I know that Cass Muther has been working on this question about women in the far right, but I also wonder how if you've seen or some of the other people working in this book have you considered that dimension? So we've seen there is a clear gender dynamic happening at the far right. Do we see a similar trend happening in the mainstream right?
This is a good question, and we have an excellent chapter in our book, which is the large N case study written by Elko Hartfeld, in which he uses data for a couple of years across different Western European societies to try to identify which are the commonalities of mainstream right parties across time and across different countries. And in fact, one of the commonalities that he finds out here, it's not related to gender, but it's related to the socioeconomic background. And in terms that those who vote for mainstream party in general tend to be a bit more upper class and well-off citizens. And this is something constant across time and across different societies. In this sense, the core constituency of mainstream right parties tend to be higher income citizens in terms of male and gender, there is no big distinction. Again, in the large end picture, there might be differences across different countries. But nevertheless, if we think about the far right, there is a lot of evidence showing that those who support the mainstream right party tend to be male rather than women, which means then that this is what Kasmude calls, these are Männerparteien. These are parties that are supported and run mainly by male. And if you remember at the end of my presentation, I also mentioned that it's important to undertake research on negative partisanship. On some early research that I'm undertaking at the moment, we have one piece that has been published recently. We show, for example, that negative partisanship towards the populist radical right, this means those who hate or against the populist radical right, tend to be women rather than male. While I think that these different pieces of evidence are relevant, because think about the transformation of the mainstream right. If mainstream right parties are willing to move towards the populist radical right, are willing to become less mainstream parties and become more far-right parties, this is going to be challenging for the core constituency of the mainstream right, because there is a moment in time in which some of these upper-class citizens who have liberal values will say, wait a moment, this is not my party anymore. And the same might happen for women, because some of those women who are against the populist radical right, if they start realizing that the mainstream right is becoming a pseudo or an ersatz version of the populist radical right, they might develop again a negative partisanship towards the mainstream right. And this is why I think that the gender dimension is very relevant to understand the interaction between the far right and the mainstream right. And again, it's one of the challenges for the mainstream right, particularly if the mainstream right is willing to adapt towards the silent counter-revolution rather than the silent revolution.
Thanks. I mean, we time, and we have a couple extra questions. So there's a follow-up. Okay, so the more authoritarian old generations used to vote for the Christian Democrats who are disappearing. So anti-liberal democratic attitudes are becoming more prominent politically?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that I think it popped up also in other question. I think it's a bit the chicken and egg question. Is this a demand side story or is a supply side story? So to what extent is that we have a transformation within the electorate and this is why parties are changing, or it's a bit the other way around, that we have parties that are changing in the policy agenda and because of that the electorate is transforming itself? And to be honest, I think it's both things at the same time. So we have on the one hand that if you follow the argument of Engelhardt, I would say it's much more a demand-side argument. He's saying, like, we have a value transformation across Western European societies, and because of that, parties need to adapt to this new scenario. But we also know that parties take positions, and because of the positions that the parties are willing to take or are not willing to take, then the electorate might identify with those parties or might end up not adopting or being in favor of the positions that those parties develop, so to say. But in this sense, going back to the question, I think that, again, we need more research, particularly to understand the differences and similarities between mainstream rights across of different Western European societies. Because we have some good knowledge, for example, about who votes for the Conservative Party in the UK, or we have some knowledge about who is voting for the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, or the PP in Spain. But what we need much more is that scholars try to develop this sort of comparative angle, either between party within one party family, for example, only the Conservative Party family or only the Christian Democratic, or trying to looking at the differences and similarities between these different party families. And why I think this is relevant, because my feeling and our book to a certain extent shows that there are some important differences for these different party families. Some of these party families are more problems to adapt in terms of issues related to gender or to newer generations, whereas other party families, the liberal in particular, I think, has a bit more flexibility to develop a different types of policy packages that can generate a better connection, for example, with newer generations than as can be the case with the Christian Democratic Party family.
Okay. Well, I think that we are finishing 10 minutes early, but we're also slowly losing some of the people. I guess they want to go for dinner. But I just want to spend the last 2 or 3 minutes, first of all, thanking Cristobal for his time and an amazing, really interesting talk and discussion, which also fits very well with what I've seen throughout this conference. So actually, I'm quite glad that we are kind of speaking around the same issues and the same topics, and I hope everyone in the audience has also enjoyed this talk. I mean, obviously, out, so you can get your copies. I think it's $26.99 on Cambridge website. So thank you very much for your time and for being here. On another topic, I like to remind you kind of for tomorrow, we have a great lineup as well. It's going to be presentations from 9:15 when we're going to give a kickoff of the day, and we are going to end the conference with the presentation of the British General Election 2019 book, which is the latest part of this kind of long-standing series of books for every election in the UK. And also, we're going to have over lunchtime the EPOP annual general meeting, the AGM. So make sure you come over and participate. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. Thank you, Cristobal. It was great, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.